The town of Millfield, Ohio, was the kind of place people often drove through without giving much thought. Rows of modest brick houses lined the main street. Local diners advertised homemade pies on chalkboards, and neighbors still left their doors unlocked during the day. It was the sort of community where gossip spread faster than newsprint, yet scandals were rare. For years, the police department had dealt mostly with traffic violations, noise complaints, and the occasional bar fight that broke out on Friday nights. That was why, when the first reports surfaced that something terrible had happened inside one of Millfield's homes, people struggled to believe it. It wasn't just the rumor of violence that stunned them. It was who the victim was. A 3-year-old girl, barely old enough to speak in complete sentences. The child, whom authorities would later identify only as Emily to protect her privacy, had been discovered in troubling circumstances one gray morning. Her hair was tangled. Her eyes were wide with a fear that seemed too heavy for someone so small. A concerned neighbor, noticing strange sounds and shadows moving past curtained windows, had called the police. When officers arrived, what they saw behind the closed doors of that ordinary house shook them deeply. Details of the discovery were not immediately released to the public, but word of mouth carried fragments of the truth. Something had happened in that house that no one wanted to say aloud. Whispers spread at the grocery store, in church pews, and in the waiting area of the local diner. It's about that little girl. She saw something. The police don't know what to do. Detective Michael Harris, a seasoned officer with 20 years on the force, was one of the first to respond to the call. He was used to reading crime scenes like puzzle pieces, but this time, the missing piece wasn't an object or a statement. It was a child. Emily didn't cry when the officers entered. She didn't cling to them either. She simply stared at the floor, holding a worn stuffed rabbit by its ear. For Harris, that silence was louder than any scream. When the investigation began, police quickly realized their greatest challenge. The only witness to what had happened was Emily herself. But how could a 3-year-old convey the truth in a way that would hold up in court? She was too young to give a traditional statement. Too young to sit through hours of questioning. Too young to even understand why adults in uniforms wanted her to talk about things she clearly didn't want to remember. The decision to involve the court was not made lightly. Some officers believed it was too much to ask of her. Others argued that the truth could not remain buried, not if justice was to be served. In the end, prosecutors insisted that her presence, however limited, was necessary. The case drew attention quickly, not only from the media, but also from professionals who had studied child psychology and trauma. Experts explained that children, especially very young ones, often reveal the truth in fragments, sometimes with just a word or two. They cannot lie with the practiced ease of adults, nor do they grasp the weight of manipulation. That innocence, paradoxically, gave Emily's voice more credibility than many witnesses twice her age. Yet convincing the public of this was another matter. Some residents of Millfield doubted a toddler could play any role in a courtroom. "She's a baby," one woman muttered outside the courthouse. "How can a baby decide the fate of grown men?" Others saw it differently. "Children don't lie," another countered. "If she says something, we better listen." Through it all, Emily remained sheltered from the noise. Authorities placed her with a temporary guardian while arrangements were made for her care. But even in safety, she seemed haunted. A social worker assigned to her case described her as quiet, withdrawn, and hesitant to meet anyone's gaze. At night, she often woke from nightmares, clutching her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. Detective Harris couldn't shake the feeling that she carried the entire case in her small hands. He often found himself sitting in his office, late into the evening, staring at the case files and wondering how the justice system, with all its rules and rigidity, could bend enough to allow truth to come from a child. It was then that someone suggested the use of Max, a highly trained police dog who had been part of the department for years. Max wasn't the kind of police dog most people imagined. He wasn't trained for attack or aggression. Instead, he was trained for comfort. He had spent time in schools, hospitals, and even therapy centers, offering calm companionship to children facing trauma. The idea was simple. If Emily was to appear in court, perhaps Max could be by her side, giving her the sense of safety she needed to find her voice. The judge approved the request. It was unconventional, but so was the case. And so, as the trial date drew closer, preparations began for a courtroom unlike any the town had seen before. Meanwhile, the town's atmosphere thickened with tension. Neighbors whispered about the day Emily would appear. Some feared it would be too much for her. Others waited anxiously for the moment she might speak. Reporters began arriving from outside Millfield, their cameras turning the sleepy courthouse into a national spotlight. Emily, however, seemed unaware of the attention. To her, the courthouse was just another unfamiliar building, filled with strange faces and echoing hallways. She held tightly to her rabbit, rarely letting go. Her world had been reduced to the simplest of things: the comfort of her toy, the quiet presence of Max, and the soft voices of those who tried to protect her. For Detective Harris, the hardest part was the waiting. He had seen cases collapse before witnesses backing out, evidence lost, juries unconvinced. But this time, it felt different. It felt fragile, as though the truth balanced on a thread that could snap at any moment. He knew the little girl didn't have to say much. A single word might be enough. The question was, would she say it? By the time the first day of the trial arrived, Millfield no longer felt like the same small town. Its quiet streets now carried the weight of an extraordinary case. Inside the courthouse, every eye would soon turn to a 3-year-old girl whose voice, or silence, could determine everything. And no one, not the police, not the lawyers, not even Max, could predict what would happen when she finally stepped forward. The first time Detective Harris saw Emily, after that morning in her home, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor of a foster home, her tiny hands carefully arranging puzzle pieces. She didn't look up when he entered, didn't greet him, or ask who he was. She simply moved one piece after another with an intensity that seemed too old for her age. It wasn't the behavior of a playful toddler. It was the behavior of someone carrying a burden too heavy to name. Harris knelt down on the carpet beside her. "Hi, Emily," he said softly. She didn't respond. After a moment, she pushed the puzzle piece aside and picked up her stuffed rabbit, hugging it close to her chest. That was when Harris knew this child wasn't going to talk easily. But she didn't need to say much. Even the smallest words could hold the truth they were looking for. The investigation team gathered later that week to discuss strategy. Prosecutors, social workers, and officers filled the cramped conference room, voices overlapping in frustration. "She's only 3, one of the prosecutors argued. "How can we put a toddler on the stand? The defense will tear this apart." "But she's the only one who saw what happened," Harris replied firmly. "No one else was there. If she says even one thing, just one, it could link to the evidence we already have." A social worker interjected gently. "Children that age don't give traditional testimony. They won't sit there and answer a string of questions. But they can communicate in their own way, sometimes with gestures, sometimes with a single phrase. We just need to make sure she feels safe enough to do it." That was when the idea of bringing Max into the picture became more than just a suggestion. Max wasn't like other police dogs. He was a large German shepherd with a golden brown coat and calm, observant eyes. Instead of chasing suspects, Max specialized in emotional support. Over the years, he had visited schools to comfort anxious children, accompanied officers on welfare checks, and even spent time in hospitals, resting his head on the laps of patients too nervous to speak. Max had a gift. He could sense fear, pain, and vulnerability, and his very presence seemed to melt some of it away. "Bring Max in," Harris said. "If she's going to talk to anyone, she might talk with him beside her." The decision was approved. A week later, Emily met Max for the first time in a quiet playroom at the courthouse. The girl sat timidly in a chair, her stuffed rabbit balanced on her knees. Max was led in by his handler, and immediately lowered himself to the floor, resting his chin on his paws. He didn't bark or move closer. He simply waited. At first, Emily didn't react. But then, slowly, she slid off the chair and inched closer to the dog. Within minutes, her tiny fingers reached out to touch his fur. Max didn't flinch. He simply let her explore, his calm breathing a steady rhythm in the room. For the first time since Harris had met her, Emily's shoulders seemed to relax. She whispered something to the rabbit in her arms, then leaned against Max's side. The handler smiled. That's his gift. He doesn't push, he lets them come to him. From that moment forward, Max became Emily's shadow. Whenever she was brought in for gentle interviews, Max was there. Whenever she seemed to shrink back into silence, the dog would nuzzle against her or simply sit close, a living shield against the world. And slowly, very slowly, Emily began to whisper words. The words didn't come in full sentences, and they didn't always make sense to the adults in the room. But they were fragments, names, objects, emotions that matched pieces of the evidence investigators already had. Each small utterance was like a spark in the darkness, guiding the case forward. Still, Harris knew whispers in a playroom were different from words spoken in court. And court was coming fast. The town buzzed with rumors. People debated in diners and whispered in church aisles about whether a 3-year-old could really take the stand. Some argued it was cruel, that the child would be scarred for life. Others insisted it was necessary justice, had no age limit, and if Emily held the truth, she needed to be heard. Meanwhile, legal experts from outside Millfield began weighing in. Television pundits questioned the admissibility of testimony from a toddler. Some compared it to hearsay. Others argued it was more reliable than anything an adult could concoct. After all, a child had no reason to manipulate the outcome of a trial she didn't understand. As the day approached, the defense team filed motions to exclude Emily altogether. "She's a baby," their lead attorney declared. "You cannot base a case of this magnitude on baby talk and stuffed animals." But the judge disagreed. With proper accommodations, such as allowing Max to accompany her and limiting the scope of questioning, the child would be permitted to speak. For Detective Harris, the decision was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. Everything depended on what Emily might say in that courtroom. And the truth was, no one could predict it. She might sit in silence. She might cry. Or she might whisper just enough to tilt the balance of justice. In the days leading up to the trial, Harris spent time watching Emily interact with Max. He marveled at how the dog seemed to know exactly when to lean closer, when to stay still, and when to gently nudge her hand. The bond between them grew quickly, as though Max had been waiting his whole life for this single purpose. One afternoon, as Emily sat stroking Max's fur, she looked up at Harris and whispered something. It wasn't much, just 2 simple words. Harris froze, stunned. It was the first time she had voluntarily spoken to him, and the words carried weight. They connected directly to a piece of evidence in the case file. Harris didn't react outwardly. He didn't want to scare her back into silence. But inside, his heart pounded. If she could say those words here, with Max at her side, maybe, just maybe, she could say them again, in front of a jury. As the trial date drew closer, Harris knew one thing. Emily wasn't just a witness. She was the witness. And Max wasn't just a comfort dog, he was her lifeline. The outcome of the entire case rested on whether this unlikely pair, a toddler, and a German shepherd, could stand before a room full of strangers and reveal the truth. The world would soon see what no one in Millfield could have imagined. The smallest voice in town preparing to speak in the largest room of all. The courthouse in Millfield had never seen so much attention. It was an old brick building, modest compared to the towering courts in bigger cities, with creaking wooden floors and windows that let in too much light. Normally, it hosted traffic disputes or minor civil cases. But now, the quiet town's humble courtroom was about to become the stage for a trial that would capture the country's attention. From the moment the trial date was announced, reporters poured into Millfield. Camera crews parked their vans along the curb, their antennas stretching into the gray sky. Journalists scribbled notes at diner counters while interviewing locals who clutched steaming cups of coffee, eager to share their version of the story. National networks dispatched correspondents. For the first time in living memory, Millfield felt less like a sleepy suburb and more like the eye of a storm. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was equally tense. Court staff whispered in hallways. Jurors were carefully selected under the glare of the media, and attorneys on both sides sharpened their strategies. Everyone knew this trial was different. The evidence existed, yes, but it was incomplete. The strongest thread tying it all together wasn't a fingerprint or a confession. It was a little girl who could barely say her own name clearly. Detective Harris walked through the building a week before the trial began, studying every detail. He traced the route Emily would take, from the side entrance, up the narrow staircase, and into the courtroom. He examined the witness stand, noting how high the wooden seat was compared to her tiny frame. He worried about everything. The sound of the gavel startling her, the press breathing too loudly, even the smell of old wood and floor polish overwhelming her senses. That was when the idea of adjustments came into play. The judge, a firm but compassionate man named Judge Callahan, agreed that certain accommodations were necessary. Emily wouldn't sit in the full witness chair. Instead, a smaller seat would be placed beside it, low enough for her feet to touch the floor. Max would be allowed to enter and remain by her side throughout her testimony, something highly unusual in a courtroom, but deemed essential in this case. Still, even with accommodations, no one could guarantee what Emily would do. Would she freeze under the stares of strangers? Would she shrink back into silence, clutching her stuffed rabbit as the trial moved on without her? Or would she speak the truth, even in fragments, and shift the balance of justice forever? The defense team counted on silence. Their lead attorney, sharp and unrelenting, knew that if Emily didn't speak, the jury might doubt the prosecution's entire case. He openly mocked the idea of relying on a toddler in interviews with the press. "We're not in a fairy tale," he scoffed. "You don't decide a man's fate based on bedtime stories." His words made headlines, sparking public outrage. The prosecutors, however, quietly built their argument around Emily's innocence. "Children this young don't lie the way adults do," Assistant District Attorney Carla Ruiz explained during prep meetings. "If she says even 2 words that align with evidence, the jury will listen. And they'll believe her, because she has no agenda. She's not capable of one." Meanwhile, Emily continued to spend time with Max, preparing in her own way for the day ahead. She practiced sitting in a small chair while the dog curled up beside her. Sometimes she whispered to him, her words too faint for others to hear. At other times, she remained silent, staring into his calm brown eyes as if drawing strength from his steady presence. On one particularly tense afternoon, Harris visited her at the foster home. She was sitting on the porch, legs dangling, with Max's leash wrapped loosely around her hand. The stuffed rabbit rested on her lap. "You don't have to be afraid," Harris told her gently. "Max will be with you the whole time. No one will take him away." Emily didn't respond right away. She leaned down, burying her face in Max's fur, before whispering something so soft Harris almost missed it. He caught only 2 words. His chest tightened. They were the same 2 words she had whispered weeks earlier, the words that could change everything. He didn't push her. He simply nodded and said, "That's enough," because he knew those 2 words, spoken in court, might be the turning point. The night before the trial, Millfield felt restless. Lights glowed late in living room windows as neighbors speculated about what would happen. Some prayed for Emily's courage. Others worried about the toll it would take on her fragile mind. In his office, Harris sat staring at the case files, his hand resting on Max's leash. He thought about all the witnesses he'd prepared over the years, tough men, nervous women, hardened criminals. Never a child this young. Never someone whose innocence was both her weakness and her greatest strength. He couldn't shake the image of her tiny hand clutching Max's fur. Morning came, and with it, a gray drizzle that turned the courthouse steps slick. Reporters crowded the entrance, umbrellas clashing as they jostled for position. Police set up barriers to keep them at bay. Inside, the courtroom filled with people, jurors, lawyers, townsfolk eager to see history unfold. The buzz quieted as Judge Callahan entered, his gavel echoing like thunder across the room. And then, it was time. Emily entered through the side door, escorted by a social worker. The gallery fell silent. She was smaller than most had imagined, dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair tied back with a ribbon. In one hand, she clutched her rabbit. In the other, she held Max's leash. The dog walked beside her with quiet dignity, his head held high, his eyes scanning the room protectively. The sight struck everyone. A hush lingered as she was guided to her seat. Some jurors exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Even the defense attorney's smirk faltered for a moment. Emily sat down. Max curled at her feet, pressing close to her leg. The judge leaned forward, speaking gently, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it in that courtroom. "Hello, Emily. You're very brave to be here today." She didn't respond. She simply stared at the floor, twisting the rabbit's ear in her fingers. For a long moment, the silence hung heavy. Everyone wondered the same thing. Would she speak at all? Detective Harris, watching from the back of the courtroom, felt his heart pounding in his chest. The entire case rested on the shoulders of a child barely old enough to understand the word court, and though no one knew it yet, within that silence lay the power to change everything. The courtroom had never been so still. Not even the clicking of pens or the rustle of paper disturbed the air. Everyone seemed frozen in their seats as the tiny girl in the blue dress sat at the front, her stuffed rabbit perched on her lap, and Max, the German shepherd, curled loyally at her feet. The judge's words hung in the air. "Hello, Emily. You're very brave to be here today." But Emily didn't look up. She pressed her small fingers into the rabbit's worn ear and kept her eyes fixed on the polished wooden floor. The jury leaned forward slightly. The prosecutor shifted in her chair, her notes untouched. Even the defense attorney, who had spent weeks ridiculing the idea of a child testifying, held his tongue. Time stretched unbearably. 5 seconds felt like 50. Some in the gallery began to wonder if she would speak at all. The judge gave a gentle nod toward the prosecutor, signaling her to try. Assistant District Attorney Carla Ruiz cleared her throat softly. She had prepared for this moment with painstaking care, practicing the simplest of questions, avoiding anything that could frighten or confuse the child. "Emily," she said softly, leaning forward so her voice wouldn't echo. "Do you see Max sitting there with you?" The girl's eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the dog. Her hand shifted, the leash twisting in her fingers. She gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. A ripple of relief passed through the room. She could respond. That's good, Ruiz continued gently. Max is here to help you. Do you like Max? Emily hesitated, then whispered something. No one heard it except the microphone placed discreetly near her. The sound carried, soft and fragile, through the speakers. Yes. It was just one word, but it was enough to make the jury sit straighter, the spectators exhale. The prosecutor smiled warmly, careful not to overwhelm the moment. You're doing wonderful, Emily, she said. Can you tell us who you're holding in your lap? The child lifted her stuffed rabbit ever so slightly, whispering, Bunny. Again, relief washed through the courtroom. She was speaking, however briefly. Detective Harris, watching from the back, clenched his fists in his pockets. He had told himself not to expect too much, not to put too heavy a weight on her shoulders. But inside, he prayed she would find the courage for just 2 more words. The 2 words that mattered most. Ruiz glanced at the judge, who gave her the smallest nod. It was time. She leaned in again, her voice as soft as a lullaby. Emily, she asked, can you tell us who hurt you? The question settled over the courtroom like a thundercloud. The defense attorney immediately objected, but the judge raised his hand. Overruled. The witness may answer if she chooses. Every pair of eyes turned to the little girl. The silence was so deep that even the rain tapping faintly against the courthouse windows could be heard. Emily froze. She pulled Bunny closer to her chest, her knuckles white. For a moment, it seemed as though she might withdraw completely. Her lower lip trembled, her eyes darted toward the gallery where strangers stared back at her. Max lifted his head. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed his body closer to her leg, his warm fur brushing against her calf. Emily felt the gentle weight, the silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. She buried her fingers in his fur. Her lips parted. At first, no sound came. Then, almost too softly to believe, she whispered 2 words into the microphone. Daddy did. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Someone in the gallery clapped a hand over their mouth. A juror blinked rapidly, her eyes shining with tears. Even the court reporter faltered, hands pausing on the keyboard before catching up. But the most remarkable reaction came from Max. The dog, who had been calm throughout, suddenly froze. His tail stopped wagging, his ears pricked up, and he sat perfectly still, leaning harder into Emily, as if recognizing the gravity of what she had just said. Detective Harris felt his stomach drop. He had suspected. They all had. But to hear it spoken in that tiny, trembling voice, it was different. It was undeniable. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. Objection, he barked. This is inadmissible. She's 3 years old. This cannot— Sit down, Judge Callahan ordered, his voice sharp. The objection is noted and overruled. The jury will disregard the tone of counsel. But the jury didn't look at the lawyer. Their eyes remained fixed on Emily, whose head now rested against Max's side, as though she had released a burden too heavy to carry alone. Ruiz didn't press further. She knew better than to overwhelm the child. Thank you, Emily, she said softly, her voice steady but her throat tight. That was very brave. The judge called a brief recess, sensing the weight of what had just occurred. As people filed out into the hallway, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters scrambled for their phones, their voices urgent as they dictated headlines that would race across the nation within minutes. 3-year-old names father in court. Police dog reacts as child breaks silence. Smallest witness, biggest truth. Inside the quiet witness room, Emily sat on the floor beside Max, stroking his fur. Her rabbit lay forgotten for the moment. She seemed calmer, lighter somehow, as if saying those words had freed her from an invisible cage. Detective Harris entered, crouching to meet her eyes. You are very brave, Emily, he said softly. She didn't respond, but she leaned against Max and closed her eyes. That was enough. For Harris, those two words echoed louder than any testimony he had heard in his career. They were simple, yes, but simple words often carried the most devastating weight. Daddy did. 2 syllables that cut through lies, defenses, and legal maneuvers. 2 syllables that changed everything. In the hallway, the defense attorney raged, insisting they would challenge the testimony, arguing that a toddler couldn't be trusted. But deep down, even he knew the damage was done. The jury had heard the truth, unfiltered and raw, from the only witness who mattered. When the court resumed, the tone had shifted irreversibly. Evidence that once seemed circumstantial now gained a sharper edge. Prosecutors tied Emily's words to physical proof already in their possession markings on the walls. Items recovered from the home, inconsistencies in the father's statements. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to align. But the most unforgettable moment of the entire trial had already passed. It wasn't the arguments, or the cross-examinations, or even the verdict that would come later. It was the silence before those 2 whispered words, the dog's frozen stillness, and the collective intake of breath as the truth was spoken by the smallest voice in the room. And as Emily was gently led out of the courtroom that day, clutching Max's leash with one hand and Bunny with the other, the people who had witnessed it knew they would never forget what they had seen or heard. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. The courtroom was still vibrating with the weight of those 2 words. Daddy did. It was as if the phrase had left an invisible crack running through the walls, through the tables, through every person present. For a few seconds after Emily whispered them, no one seemed to breathe. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the steady sound of rain pattering against the tall windows. Then came the ripple. Gasps spread across the gallery, sharp intakes of breath from strangers who had never met Emily, but felt her pain land like a stone in their own chests. A juror wiped her eyes quickly, as though ashamed of her tears. One of the deputies by the door shifted his weight uneasily, glancing toward the defendant. The words had pierced every corner of the room. And Max the German shepherd, who had been calm and relaxed through hours of waiting, froze. His ears stiffened, his body pressed closer to the child, and he stopped moving altogether. Dogs don't understand the language of courts or evidence, but they understand emotion, fear, truth. His stillness was louder than any bark, louder than any alarm. People noticed, even the judge. The defense attorney was the first to break the moment. He leapt to his feet, his chair scraping harshly across the wooden floor. Objection. His voice was too loud, almost desperate. This is preposterous. A toddler barely verbal uttering vague words. This cannot be admitted as credible testimony. Judge Callahan's gavel came down with a crack. Order. Sit down, counsel. The attorney bristled, his face red. Your Honor, I insist this so-called testimony be stricken from the record. A child of this age. Overruled, the judge said firmly. The witness's statement will stand. The jury will evaluate its weight. The prosecutor, Carla Ruiz, remained calm, though her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers. She knew pressing Emily further would be a mistake. The child had already given them the truth, unprompted, uncoached, in the purest and most devastating way possible. Ruiz smiled softly at Emily. Thank you, she said. You've been very brave. Then she asked no more. The judge called a recess. The courthouse erupted as soon as the gavel struck. Reporters dashed toward the exit, fumbling for their phones. Words spilled across notepads. Child names father in court. Police dog reacts. 3-year-old delivers testimony that could decide case. Detective Harris didn't follow the rush. He stayed seated for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest. He had prepared himself for silence, for the possibility that Emily would say nothing at all. He had prayed she might offer 1 or 2 words. But to hear her say that, to hear her confirm in 2 syllables what the evidence had only hinted at it, shook him to his core. He glanced at the defendant. The man sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting back and forth. He looked smaller than he had just minutes earlier. His confidence eroded. For the first time since the trial began, Harris saw fear in him. Real fear. In the witness room, Emily sat on the floor with Max, pressing her face into his fur. She looked exhausted, her little body sagging as though speaking had drained her. Bunny lay on her lap, half forgotten, while her small hand stroked the dog's side. Max didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't look at anyone else. His focus remained entirely on her, as though he knew his job wasn't over. "She's incredible," Ruiz whispered as she entered the room. "Braver than most adults I've ever seen take that stand. She shouldn't have had to do it," Harris replied quietly. "But she did." He knelt down in front of Emily, meeting her wide, tired eyes. "You did so well. You helped us. You helped everyone." Emily didn't answer. She just leaned harder into Max, who sighed deeply and closed his eyes, still pressed against her leg. Back in the courtroom, the defense scrambled. They requested an immediate mistrial, arguing the jury had been unfairly swayed by emotional manipulation. The presence of a dog, they claimed, was a theatrical stunt designed to elicit sympathy. But Judge Callahan wasn't moved. He denied the motion flatly. The dog's role has been explained and justified. Counsel is aware of this arrangement. The trial will proceed. The defense then shifted strategy. They worked to sow doubt, reminding the jury at every turn that children of 3 were unreliable, easily influenced, prone to fantasy. They cited studies, quoted experts, painted Emily's words as little more than babble. But the image of her tiny voice, whispering "Daddy did," while Max froze beside her, was burned into the jurors' minds. No argument, no slick presentation of data could erase it. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Some held signs reading "Believe Emily." Others stood in defense of the accused, insisting that justice shouldn't hinge on a child's words. But the majority simply stood in stunned silence, waiting for updates. That night, television anchors replayed the moment endlessly. Clips of the hushed courtroom, of Max pressing closer to Emily, of the defense attorney shouting his objection, all filled the airwaves. Legal analysts debated the consequences. Some called it groundbreaking. Others warned of dangerous precedent. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The case had shifted irreversibly. For Detective Harris, the turning point wasn't about law or precedent. It was about truth. He had been in courtrooms where lies twisted everything into knots, where justice slipped through cracks in the system. But that day, he had witnessed something rare, truth unadorned, uncalculated, spoken by a child too young to even understand the word strategy. The next morning, when court resumed, the air felt different. Jurors sat more rigidly, their eyes sharper, their attention fixed. The prosecution began weaving Emily's words into the fabric of their case, connecting them to physical evidence, timelines, and witness statements. Suddenly, the puzzle had a centerpiece, and everything around it began to fit. The defense objected at every turn. They cross-examined police officers harshly, tried to discredit investigators, even attacked Harris's record. But they couldn't undo what Emily had said. And Max's reaction, simple, instinctive, impossible to script, lingered in everyone's mind. Jurors mentioned later that they couldn't stop thinking about it. "You can't train a dog to fake that," one said. He knew. You could see it. By the end of the week, it was clear. The momentum had shifted. The prosecution no longer fought an uphill battle. The defense was the one scrambling, gasping for footholds, trying desperately to claw back control. The turning point had come from the smallest witness, from a whisper that barely carried through the microphone, from two words that cut through layers of doubt and complexity, and from a dog who froze not from fear, but from recognizing the truth that even grown men had failed to speak. The morning after Emily's testimony, the courthouse felt heavier than usual, as though the building itself understood that something irreversible had occurred. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices overlapping in a chorus of speculation. Inside, the jury filed into their seats with expressions that no longer looked neutral. Their eyes carried weight, focus, and something else, conviction. Detective Harris noticed it immediately. He had sat through trials where jurors slouched, stared at the clock, or fought to stay awake. This was different. Emily's words had etched themselves into their minds, and now every detail of the case seemed sharper in their eyes. The prosecution seized on that shift. Carla Ruiz entered the courtroom with a new energy, her stack of notes neatly aligned, her expression determined. She had always been meticulous, but now she carried something more momentum. She opened that day's arguments by reminding the jury of the child's courage. "You heard it," Ruiz said, her voice steady but heavy with meaning. "Not from me, not from the detectives, not from experts or lawyers. You heard it from the person who lived it. From a 3-year-old, too young to invent such a thing, too innocent to manipulate the truth for gain. 2 words simple, clear, and devastating. 2 words that cannot be ignored." The defense immediately objected, insisting that Ruiz was leaning too heavily on testimony they considered unreliable. Judge Callahan overruled again, cautioning both sides to stay within limits, but allowing the jury to weigh what they'd heard. Then came the evidence. Piece by piece, Ruiz began connecting Emily's whispered words. Daddy did to a mountain of corroboration. Photos of the child's bedroom. Forensic reports matching fibers. Neighbors' testimonies about heated arguments overheard late at night. Medical records that raised far too many red flags to be ignored. Each thread was tied back to the simple statement. Alone, the evidence might have seemed circumstantial, but framed through the lens of the child's words, it painted a chilling picture. A defense tried to fight. They brought in an expert witness on child psychology, a professor with polished glasses and a rehearsed tone. He explained how children Emily's age could confuse reality with imagination, how they could be coached intentionally or unintentionally by adults around them. But during cross-examination, Ruiz asked a single pointed question. "Professor, in your professional opinion, can a dog like the certified support animal you saw sitting beside the child be coached to freeze at the exact moment those words were spoken?" The professor hesitated, faltered, and finally admitted, "No." That silence spoke louder than his entire testimony. The prosecution wasn't the only one feeling the impact. In the gallery, whispers turned to murmurs. Outside, the case had become a lightning rod. News channels ran segments dissecting the moment. Social media flooded with hashtags. Hashtag Daddy Did, hashtag Justice for Emily, hashtag Max the Dog. Some argued passionately in Emily's defense, while others cautioned against placing the fate of a man on the fragile words of a toddler. Still, the momentum was undeniable. For the defense, panic set in. They began attacking every weakness they could find in the investigation. They grilled Detective Harris on the stand, questioning his methods, implying that he had planted doubts in the child's mind during their early interactions. Harris remained composed, his voice steady, his answers precise. "Detective," the defense attorney sneered, "isn't it true you have a personal investment in this case? That you care deeply about this child's well-being?" "Yes," Harris replied without hesitation. "I care, but facts don't depend on feelings. And the fact is her words match the evidence we've gathered." The attorney tried to twist the response, but Harris had struck a chord. Jurors nodded slightly. Meanwhile, Max became more than a silent comfort in the courtroom. His presence was steady, calming. Each day, as Emily sat quietly during breaks, Max lay beside her, offering the same quiet strength. The jurors noticed. Some even glanced at him during tense exchanges, as though grounding themselves in his calm. By the end of that week, the defense's arguments sounded thinner. They claimed Emily was too young, but the jury had seen her whisper those words without hesitation. They claimed her memory was unreliable, but the physical evidence told the same story. They claimed she had been coached, but her innocence, her small trembling voice, had rung with a truth that couldn't be rehearsed. The impact rippled beyond the courtroom walls. Advocacy groups for child victims rallied outside, demanding stronger protections and applauding Emily's bravery. Psychologists debated whether such young testimony should carry so much weight, but even skeptics admitted the combination of her words and the dog's instinctive reaction made this case unique. Detective Harris, though relieved, couldn't shake the weight of it. At night, he replayed the moment in his mind. The silence, the whisper, the dog's stillness. He had seen hardened criminals confess, but never had he seen truth delivered with such fragility and such finality. He knew the case was tilting toward justice, but he also knew the scars Emily carried wouldn't fade with the verdict. As the trial pushed forward, the defense made one last desperate attempt. They called the defendant himself to the stand. It was a gamble, a risky move that could either humanize him or destroy him completely. He spoke with feigned calm, insisting on his innocence, painting himself as a victim of hysteria and false accusations. He looked at the jury, at the judge, even at his own daughter. He tried to conjure the image of a misunderstood man, betrayed by circumstance. But the moment he said, "I love my daughter, and I would never hurt her," a juror shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down at her notes. The words felt hollow compared to the fragile honesty of the little girl who had whispered the opposite. Max didn't move. He simply lay there, steady as stone, his presence a reminder of the truth they had all witnessed. The trial wasn't over. Closing arguments still loomed. The verdict still hung in the balance. But the impact was undeniable. The scales of justice had shifted, and no amount of argument could tilt them back. For the jury, the trial was no longer about uncertainty. It was about courage, the courage of a child too small for the witness chair, and the silent strength of the dog who bore witness beside her. For the public, it was no longer just another case. It was a story that touched something universal, the power of truth spoken by the weakest among us, and the way it could shake the strongest walls of denial. And for Emily, though she didn't know it, her whisper had already rewritten the future. The air inside the courthouse had changed. It wasn't just heavy anymore. It was electric, crackling with anticipation, with the sense that an ending hovered just beyond reach. Weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, objections, and evidence had brought everyone to this moment. Soon, the case that had gripped a city, and now a nation, would be in the hands of 12 strangers. Detective Harris sat in his usual place at the back, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the front. He could feel the hum of nerves in his chest, a pulse that matched the rhythm of the clock ticking above the judge's bench. Every second carried weight now. Emily wasn't in the courtroom today. She had done her part more than anyone could ever have asked of her. She was at home with a guardian, playing quietly with her stuffed rabbit and Max, who rarely left her side anymore. But even in her absence, her presence lingered. The memory of her whisper daddy did still echoed in the minds of everyone who had heard it. Now came the final act, closing arguments. Carla Ruiz rose first. She stood tall, her notes stacked neatly before her, though she barely glanced at them. Her voice was calm but resonant, carrying through the courtroom with clarity and conviction. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, you have heard a great deal in these past weeks. Testimony, evidence, expert opinions. But I want you to remember something simple. Justice is not about complexity. Justice is about truth. And sometimes truth is spoken in the smallest voice. She paused, letting the words sink in. A few jurors shifted, their eyes softening. You heard that voice, Ruiz continued. A 3-year-old child, too young to fabricate, too innocent to deceive. She told you who hurt her. She didn't hesitate. She didn't fumble. She whispered 2 words. Daddy did. She walked slowly before the jury box, her eyes meeting theirs one by one. These are not just words from a frightened child. These are words supported by evidence photographs, medical records, neighbors' testimonies. All threads leading to the same truth. And remember what else you saw. You saw Max, the trained police dog at her side, freeze at the very moment those words were spoken. Animals don't lie. They don't take sides. They react to truth. That moment spoke volumes. Ruiz's voice tightened, not with anger, but with weight. You've seen the defendant try to paint himself as the victim. You've seen him sit in that chair and tell you he loves his daughter, while evidence after evidence told you otherwise. But this case is not about what he says. It's about what she said, and what the facts say. The facts and the smallest voice in this courtroom all point in one direction. She stopped, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the jury box. Emily showed courage no child should ever have to show. Now the courage falls to you. She whispered the truth. You must speak it loudly. Deliver justice. She returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent, but the silence was alive, charged with the gravity of her words. Then the defense attorney stood. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and launched into a performance sharpened by desperation. Ladies and gentlemen, let us remember one thing. This is a court of law, not a theater of emotion. The prosecution has paraded before you the testimony of a toddler 3 years old, barely verbal, highly impressionable. You cannot base the fate of a man's life on the whispered words of a child who could not possibly understand the consequences of what she was saying. He paced the floor, gesturing dramatically. Children Emily's age are prone to fantasy. They live in imaginary worlds. They believe in monsters under the bed and fairies in the garden. Can such a child truly understand what she is saying in a courtroom, under pressure, surrounded by strangers? The attorney's tone sharpened. And let us not forget the presence of that dog. A police dog sitting at her side. An animal trained to respond to cues, to intimidate without words. That moment you all gasped at? Nothing but coincidence. A dog shifting his weight. And yet, the prosecution has spun it into some mystical sign of truth. Are we to convict a man because a dog twitched? He stopped, his eyes sweeping over the jury. This case is riddled with holes. Circumstantial evidence. Speculative testimony. Emotional manipulation. You are not here to deliver sympathy. You are here to deliver justice. And justice requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution has not given you that. They have given you drama. They have given you a show. But they have not given you certainty. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. Do not let a whisper decide a man's fate. Do not let your hearts overrule your duty. The only proper verdict here is not guilty. He sat down with a flourish, exhaling sharply as though he had just won a war. The jury was led out soon after. 12 men and women carrying the weight of everything they had heard, everything they had seen, everything they had felt. They disappeared into the deliberation room, and the waiting began. The hours dragged. Reporters huddled in the hallways, scribbling theories. Families whispered anxiously on the benches. Harris sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the door the jury had entered. His stomach knotted tighter with every passing minute. He thought about Emily, about the way her hands had trembled when she held Bunny, about the way her little voice had quivered, but not broken, about Max's stillness. He thought about the defendant's eyes, darting nervously, and the hollowness of his words on the stand. Harris had seen enough cases to know where the truth lay. But it wasn't his decision. It never was. Night fell. The jury still hadn't returned. The judge dismissed the court for the evening, ordering them to reconvene the next day. The city waited with bated breath. News channels ran non-stop coverage, replaying snippets of testimony, replaying the closing arguments, analyzing body language, speculating on outcomes. Social media exploded with divided opinion. Some feared the jury would be swayed by doubt. Others were certain justice would prevail. Inside the jury room, voices rose and fell. Some jurors pushed immediately for conviction, their minds made up since Emily spoke. Others hesitated, echoing the defense's warnings about relying too heavily on the words of a toddler. They argued late into the night, balancing the fragile weight of innocence against the immovable demand for proof. By the time dawn broke, the entire nation seemed to be holding its breath. The verdict was coming, and no one, not the judge, not the attorneys, not Detective Harris, not even the defendant, could predict which way the scales would tip. The courthouse steps were crowded before the sun rose. Reporters clustered together, microphones poised, their voices rising into the cool morning air, as though they could hasten what was coming. Supporters held signs: "Justice for Emily. Protect the innocent." Across the street, a smaller group stood in quiet opposition, repeating the defense's mantra: "Doubt is not guilt." Inside, the building pulsed with anticipation. Court staff moved briskly, faces taut with the awareness that today would mark an ending. Spectators packed the gallery, leaning forward in their seats, whispering anxiously, as if their breath alone could bend the verdict. Detective Harris sat in the back row again, his usual post, but this time his heart thudded louder than it ever had before. He had lived through dozens of trials, but never had one dug this deep under his skin. He clasped his hands together, willing himself to patience. It wasn't his decision. It never was. Yet he couldn't stop silently repeating the words. "Please. Please let them see what she gave us." The defendant entered with his attorney, his face pale but expression controlled. He sat stiffly, eyes fixed straight ahead, as though avoiding the gaze of everyone around him. His composure was brittle, a mask that threatened to crack with the slightest pressure. The bailiff called for order. Everyone stood as Judge Callahan entered. He took his seat, expression grave. "We have received word," he said, his voice steady, "that the jury has reached a verdict." The words struck like a drumbeat. Heads turned toward the door as the jurors filed in. 12 faces, solemn, carrying the weight of days spent locked in deliberation. Some looked weary, others resolute, but none revealed the secret they carried. The clerk stood. "Members of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreperson, a woman in her 40s with steady eyes, rose slowly. "We have." The room seemed to shrink, air pressing down on every chest. "Will the defendant please rise?" The man stood, shoulders rigid. His attorney placed a steadying hand on his arm, but he shook it off, staring hard at the jurors, as though defiance might save him. The foreperson unfolded the slip of paper in her hands. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of finality. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The word detonated through the courtroom. Gasps erupted, followed by muffled cries, then silence. Pure, stunned silence. The defendant's face collapsed, his composure shattering as reality sank in. His attorney slammed his fist onto the table, muttering objections that no one heard. Deputies stepped forward, their movements swift, decisive, as though justice itself propelled them. Harris exhaled, his shoulders slumping with relief he hadn't dared to expect. His vision blurred for a moment, but he blinked it clear. This wasn't about him. It never was. Judge Callahan banged his gavel, restoring order. The defendant is remanded into custody pending sentencing. This court thanks the jury for their service. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court and this community. And just like that, it was done. Outside, the courthouse erupted. Cheers and cries mingled in the air. News outlets scrambled to broadcast breaking headlines. Father convicted after daughter's whisper. Verdict hinges on testimony of child and police dog's reaction. Images of Emily and Max, taken during earlier recesses, flashed across screens nationwide. But inside the quieter corners of the courthouse, away from cameras and microphones, the impact unfolded more softly. Emily wasn't there to hear the verdict, but when Ruiz arrived at the safe house later that afternoon, she knelt down in front of the little girl. "It's over," she said gently. "You did it. You were brave, and the truth was heard." Emily tilted her head, her small fingers tangled in Max's fur. "Daddy go?" she asked softly. "Yes," Ruiz whispered, her throat tight. "Daddy won't hurt you anymore." Emily didn't smile. She didn't fully understand. But she leaned against Max, who licked her hand once solemnly, as though he understood enough for both of them. For Harris, the days that followed felt strange. Relief coursed through him, but so did exhaustion. He thought often about Emily's whisper, about the way Max had frozen, about the way the courtroom had fallen silent. He knew justice had been served, but he also knew the work wasn't done. Emily would carry her scars. Healing would take years, maybe a lifetime. But at least she had a chance. The verdict sparked ripples beyond the case itself. Advocates pushed for new policies, calling for broader acceptance of comfort animals in courtrooms, especially for vulnerable witnesses. Legal scholars debated the implications of toddler testimony, but many agreed the case had set a precedent. And across the country, families watched, holding their children a little closer, reminded of both the fragility and the resilience of innocence. Max, meanwhile, became an unlikely hero. Newspapers ran features about him, the dog who froze. Photos of him sitting faithfully at Emily's side spread online, capturing hearts. People sent letters to the department, some addressed directly to him, thanking him for his service. But Max didn't know he had become a symbol. He simply stayed by Emily's side, protecting her in the way only he could. One evening, weeks after the verdict, Harris visited Emily. He brought her a small stuffed dog, soft and floppy, with ears too big for its head. "For when Max isn't around," he told her. Emily hugged it tightly, then looked up at him with wide eyes. "Safe now?" she whispered. Harris's throat tightened. He nodded. Safe now. And in that moment, he realized that justice wasn't just about verdicts or sentences. It was about safety. About giving back what had been taken. About ensuring that a child could whisper a question and receive the answer she needed most. The case would fade from headlines eventually. Other stories would take its place. But for those who had been there, in the courtroom, in the gallery, watching the moment when truth broke through silence, they would never forget. They would remember the hush before Emily spoke. They would remember the dog's frozen stillness. They would remember the way 2 words, spoken in a whisper, could shake the foundations of denial and bring a man to justice. And for Emily, though she would grow and change, that day would remain a part of her story. Not just the pain, but the bravery. Not just the whisper, but the truth it carried. Because sometimes, the most powerful voices are the smallest. Sometimes, justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, carried on the breath of a child. steadied by the silence of a dog, and heard by a world ready to listen.